The COVID-19 pandemic has really laid bare just how urgent the housing crisis is in this country. It's a crisis that affects the vast majority of the American people in basically every city and state in the country. According to new data by the National Low-Income Housing Coalition, quote, nearly half of American workers do not earn enough to rent a one-bedroom apartment. Think about that. Half of American workers do not make enough to rent a one-bedroom apartment. Rents in the U.S. continued to increase throughout the pandemic, and a worker now needs to earn about $20.40 an hour to afford a modest one-bedroom rental. The median wage in the U.S. is about $21 an hour. So there you go. Half of those people on the bottom side of the median wage can't afford a one-bedroom apartment. And despite the fact that the pandemic has frozen much of the country's economic activity, the cost of housing has continued to increase. Average rents decreased in many places early in the pandemic, but in May 2021, prices increased by 0.46%, the largest monthly increase since 2014, when the real estate site Zillow started tracking this data. So while most Americans are struggling to meet their housing costs, the tip of the spear of the crisis has been the homelessness issue. In many cities around the country, but especially here in LA, homelessness has become the central political issue. And contrary to popular belief, the homelessness issue is tied to the rise in housing prices. Quote, in a study contained in the latest UCLA Anderson forecast released Wednesday, UCLA found that higher median rent and home prices are strongly correlated with more people living on the streets or in shelters. The research backs other studies that have found a similar relationship. Last year, Zillow released a study that showed that a 5% rent hike in LA County, where more than 50,000 people are estimated to be homeless, would cause 2,000 additional people to lose their home. Now, I live in Venice, which is arguably the nationwide center of the homelessness crisis in America. And I live just down the street from the famous Venice Boardwalk, you know, where Woody Harrelson and Wesley Snipes hustled suckers for money on the basketball court and White Men Can't Jump. But in recent years, the boardwalk has essentially become a massive homeless encampment.
Hundreds and hundreds of movies were filmed down here in Venice, and countless of celebrities I spotted right here on the Venice Boardwalk. Vendors down here that pay thousands and thousands of dollars rent just to get a spot right here on the boardwalk. And then we got all those homeless encampments right across from them. It's not only the problem with the homeless people, it's more those mentally ill people. They need medication, or the ones they're on heavy drugs. They're like really aggressive, and it's not really safe to be down here. You know my channel, German in Venice. I love Venice Beach. The reason why I'm in the United States is because I saw Venice Beach on TV all the time, the rollerblader, all the movies, and I thought I want to be in this place. But it changed so much. I've been here almost 30 years, and it's not what it used to be anymore.
That guy's YouTube channel, German in Venice, gets millions of views on every single video, and he pumps out a lot of videos. I will never understand YouTube. But he's not the only one. Many of the locals here are extremely anxious about the homeless situation, like legendary Venice Boardwalk merchant Derek the OG.
And once the pandemic hit, it's when the police were more so hands-off. You can check for yourself. You can look it up. Crime rate has went up over 300% in Venice alone. A lot of people don't want to come out here, and the ones that are out here are unaware.
Like these guys?
Yeah, they're blind. They don't know what's going on.
Tourists.
They're tourists, but we need them back.
But this is the number one tourism destination in LA,
it was
isn't
the
it?
second,
Or the
third.
second?
Disneyland, and then
okay.
All right, but yes, we want the tourism, but we want this shit cleaned up for them to feel comfortable. Why would you want to take your little girl walk past an encampment?
Right.
You know, I don't have anything against the homeless.
Yep.
I feel that there's some that choose to live this way. There's some that need help. If you look closely, you see a lot of people talk to themselves. It's not just the drugs. It's also people not taking their medicines or their meds. You know, it's people out here with serious issues, and they're just pushing them on the beach and leaving them be. If you're down here, you're good. They have a bus to come pick them up at night when it gets cold, and then they'll drop them right back off here. You know, why would you drop them off and not police them at the same time? How you doing, sister? It's always good to see you. How do you feel about Venice Beach? Do you love it as much as you
love Venice
You love
Beach,
it? And where you from?
I'm from Russia.
Russia.
Wow.
Well, she can hang.
Здравствуй.
How you doing? Man, Well, she's a tough cookie. Russia don't give a fuck.
Sorry, I had to include that last bit. So the city councilman that oversees Venice Beach is a guy named Mike Bonin, who my sources say is a solid Bernie bro. He himself has experienced homelessness back in the 1980s, and he's been instituting a plan to clean up the Venice boardwalk in a humane way.
It's the end of week 1 of a 6-week plan to systematically house the homeless and clean up the boardwalk.
Whatever random things I found out here, this is all, found out here, left behind.
32-year-old Brian Assad, originally from Florida, says he's been homeless here for a year. Spent his first night indoors at the Cadillac Hotel last night, part of Project Room Key, the state-funded shelter program Los Angeles participates in. Brian's one of more than 70 the city says has accepted interim housing so far.
People are taking the help, and then there's some people out here that,
So yeah, this project has actually been pretty successful here in Venice. And this was in stark contrast to the effort to clear the homeless encampment in Echo Park, which was done using brute force. According to an LA Times editorial, quote, over the course of 6 weeks, service providers aided by local officials moved 211 homeless people who had encamped along the Venice boardwalk for more than a year. Most of them now have interim housing, mainly in hotels and motels. A handful went to the transitional shelter in Venice. Did it cost a lot of money? Yes. Did it take a lot of effort? Yes. In fact, it took a village of outreach workers and others to move and temporarily house the scores of people who had made the beach their home. What it did not take was a force of 750 Los Angeles police officers, as was the case during the tense showdown at Echo Park Lake in the spring, when a large encampment there was cleared out. To be sure, there were police at Venice Beach, but according to city officials and the service providers at the nonprofit St. Joseph Center, which carried out the plan to move the beach dwellers into temporary housing, the police supported their efforts rather than complicating them. One big accomplishment: the effort gave lie to the trope that the homeless people living on the street are service resistant. Even people who profess their love of the view of the ocean from their tents left for brick and mortar housing. The vast majority of people living by the boardwalk at the end of June agreed to take housing by the end of July. So that's good. But increasing home prices everywhere in the country means more homelessness. So why do these home prices keep going up? Well, a big reason why is that it's very difficult to build more units in a lot of American cities. And the units that are built tend to be luxury housing, which is not much more expensive than building middle or low income housing, but the potential profits are much greater. And in his term as mayor of Los Angeles, Eric Garcetti has focused more on subsidizing the building of hotels with public money in an effort to spur tourism in anticipation of things like the Olympics and the World Cup. Think about that. The city of LA, facing a homelessness crisis, was using public money to build hotels. Now, the situation in downtown LA captures the absurdity perfectly. Downtown LA is home to Skid Row, probably the largest homeless encampment in America. In downtown LA, there are actually more vacant publicly funded hotel rooms than there are unhoused people. This is from a piece in Knock LA. Quote, at least 4,923 hotel rooms in downtown are part of luxury projects that have benefited from public money or land, while there are 3,884 sheltered and unsheltered homeless people within Skid Row and the adjoining neighborhood of Little Tokyo. So activists organized to get the city and the state to appropriate public money to buy back hotels and use them as housing solutions for the homeless.
LA County recently purchased 10 motels and hotels through the program project called Home Key. Now, it's all part of the state effort to provide rooms for those who are homeless. NBC4's John Caddy's Klingbeck has more now from Baldwin Park.
If this looks like a motel, it's because it used to be one. This was a Motel 6 here in Baldwin Park. It is now going to be home for 71 people experiencing homelessness.
Not a really pleasant experience. No, certainly not.
He was sleeping on park benches and ultimately on Skid Row when he says he got lucky meeting a case manager from Exodus Recovery. Helmut Mertenek had just been released from prison, served time for embezzlement, but had nowhere to go.
So when I came back from incarceration, I was pretty much on my own.
Now, this is home where he can focus on life's next chapter.
This gives me at least a step, to establish my own footprint again. I'm able to write resumes now, getting maybe a job application going. I'll send out about 200 resumes.
So in December of 2020, Mike Bonin, the city council member in charge of Venice, took advantage of this program and used $5 million in public funds to purchase a Ramada Inn, which is one of the places where a lot of the homeless who were cleared off the boardwalk ended up. So it sounds great, right? You know, we have all these hotels. They're not being used. They were subsidized by public money. So we'll just buy them back and use them as temporary housing for homeless. They can get back on their feet, and, you know, they can get serviced by service workers and mental health experts and things like that. So it all sounds great. Well, not to the homeowners of Venice, who organized furiously to stop the conversion of the Ramada Inn into housing for the homeless. This is from a piece in West Side Current. Quote, during Wednesday's hearing, Tracy Park from Families First Venice said that the impact the change of the use of the Ramada Inn would have on the community for the next 55 years will be significant. Quote, we are a very small community. This homeless problem is choking our neighborhoods. It's not an objection to the shelters we have. It's the city's failure to take care of what takes place within them that concerns us. And then this other neighbor, a guy named Robin Rudisil, uses one of the most insane arguments I've ever heard. He's the former chair of Venice's Land Use and Planning Committee, pointed out that the Ramada Inn gave access to hardworking families who couldn't otherwise afford hotels on the beach or boutique alternatives. Taking away affordable hotels like the Ramada is likely to change the character of Venice for decades to come. That's a good one. You love to see it. So the reactionary forces opposing Mike Bonin have found a very, very powerful ally in the sheriff of Los Angeles County, a guy named Alex Villanueva, who has essentially gone to war against him in an attempt to deal with the homeless issue using a law and order approach.
He was there today as the homeless outreach services hit the boardwalk.
What we saw was human misery.
But LA City Council member Mike Bonin says their presence was a disruption.
The approach we're trying to take in Venice is to house people without having to use uniforms and badges and guns.
We're not living in a police state.
Some seem to welcome the help. Bonin says within weeks there should be additional funding for housing and mental health. And though he dismisses Villanueva in Venice as a, quote, stunt, he offered this message.
Sheriff, if you've got some actual housing resources you can bring, if you're willing to cooperate with agencies, we're certainly willing to listen.
Now, this political battle only continues late into the evening. We asked Councilmember Bonin, are you going to explore avenues to try and keep Villanueva out of Venice? He says no, he is going to stay calm and continue to work towards delivering housing and shelter and services. But just 20 minutes ago, Sheriff Villanueva, as I read this off of my phone, posts on social media, Mr. Bonin, wherever you are, and I'm quoting here, Chuck, get out of the way.
That sounds like a threat. Now, right now, Mike Bonin is facing a recall election organized by the Venice homeowners. And there are signs advocating for his recall all over my neighborhood. Like, my neighbors all have them up. And it's worth noting that Nithya Raman, the Socialist City Council member who was elected on a platform of humane solutions to the homelessness problem, is also facing a recall election. The question is why? Well, in America, it's because the most important constituencies for any local government tend to be homeowners. Property taxes provide a huge chunk of the revenue for local governments, and as a result, homeowners hold tremendous sway. And these homeowners are obsessed with the prices of their properties, in that they expect them to go up every single year, no matter what, because homeownership is the primary way for most people to build any sort of wealth in this country. Homes in America are not seen as a place to live, but a long-term investment vehicle. And homeowners are convinced that having homeless shelters and low-income housing in their neighborhoods will depress home prices. Ironically, this leads to more homelessness, which depresses home prices even more. In July 2021, for example, Venice home prices were down 12.4% compared to last year, all due to the homelessness issue. But that's why they just want the cops to, quote, deal with it, as in just get them out of here. And there are always psycho cops lying around like Sheriff Villanueva who are more than happy to oblige. But aside from the cruelty of it all, it just doesn't even solve the problem. You're just playing a game of whack-a-mole throughout the city as the homeless are shuffled from one neighborhood to the other and eventually back to where they came. Things like Project Homekey to buy back hotels are a good start, but they're only a start. Eventually, you need to build much, much more public housing that is independent from the marketplace. This will begin the process of decommodifying housing and stopping the ever-rising cost of living, which has become a problem all over the capitalist world. For example, Los Angeles has not built a single unit of public housing since 1955. And to see the potential of public housing, we can look to the past. specifically in the capital of Austria, Vienna. After the fall of the Austro-Hungarian Empire in the wake of World War I, socialists won elections in the capital of the new Austrian Republic, Vienna. They controlled the city from 1919 until Hitler took over Austria in 1934. This period became known as Red Vienna, and one of Red Vienna's great accomplishments was building stunning public housing that improved the living conditions of the city's working class tremendously. And that legacy lives on today, where as many as 2/3 of the city's residents live in affordable public housing that looks like this.
Here in Vienna, 2/3 of its citizens live in subsidised social housing. But in the UK, less than 1 in 10 live in a council house. And not only that, the quality and style is simply out of this world.
So is this what you think of when you think of council housing?
This is Alt Erla, a social housing estate on the outskirts of Vienna. It may look like tough brutalist architecture, but actually it's humane, caring design of the highest order.
Oh wow, look at that. They've even got an indoor swimming pool as well.
They have nurseries, schools and tennis courts all conveniently on site. I can't quite believe this.
This is about long-term thinking, allowing people to put down roots, giving them stability. I mean, just imagine if I proposed a high-density council housing estate with loads of swimming pools, indoor and outdoor, clubs, play spaces. I'd be laughed out of town because everybody would say you couldn't do that.
They interviewed in that documentary a woman who lived in one of those apartments for $600 a month, and it looked beautiful. And Austria's neighbor, Germany, is currently seeing a massive fight around housing in their capital city of Berlin. Berlin has seen housing prices go up dramatically in recent years as massive investment funds gobble up thousands of housing units and jack up prices. Does that sound familiar? Now renters are fighting back. This is from a piece in the FT. Quote, a radical campaign urging Berlin city government to expropriate 240,000 properties from Germany's biggest publicly listed residential landlords, accusing them of squeezing out lower income long-term residents through shoddy maintenance and jacked up rents. After collecting more than 350,000 petition signatures, their proposal, which targets corporate landlords with more than 3,000 apartments each, will be voted on in a local referendum in September. Polling suggests nearly half of Berliners support expropriation, which would force the companies to sell their properties to the city government at a fair price. What does it mean that my flat is now a commodity on the stock market, where the goal is to draw as much profit as possible for shareholders, said Jonas, who lives in a property in the Kreuzberg owned by Berlin's biggest listed landlord, Deutsche Wohnen, the main target of the campaign. These questions are now resonating across Berlin and beyond. Housing has to be decommodified. If we leave it to the private capitalists, there will always be a housing problem. Friedrich Engels understood this way back in 1872 when he wrote a pamphlet called The Housing Question. He wrote, quote, it is perfectly clear that the existing state is neither willing nor able to do anything to remedy the housing difficulty. The state is nothing but the organized collective power of the possessing classes, the landowners and the capitalists as against the exploited classes, the peasants and the workers. What the individual capitalists, and it is here only a question of these because in this matter the landowner, who is also concerned, acts primarily as a capitalist, do not want, their state also does not want. If therefore the individual capitalists deplore the housing shortage, but can hardly be persuaded even superficially to palliate its most terrifying consequences, then the collective capitalists, the state, will not do much more. Which is to say, in the words of Engels, we must protect Mike Bonin from these reactionary homeowners in Venice. We can't let him get recalled.
Nando, that was so good. Did Kale give you that quote from Engels?
No.
No? Oh, I love it. Okay. No, I just thought it was
I don't
like
listen
such a
to Kale
move. You do.
I don't
okay.
listen to him.
Good. It's good to not listen to our producer.
Yeah.
No, I loved your segment so much. So I wanted to make a point about the NIMBYs in Venice. And it's not just Venice. We're seeing this certainly across the state, but also across the country where people don't want homeless people in their backyard, even though they would be housed. But we have case studies of these types of programs working, right? So Utah is a really good example where they decided, because they had a huge problem with homelessness in Salt Lake City, and they're like, you know what we're going to do? We're just going to give them housing, like permanent housing, like no strings attached. We're not going to tell them they need to do X, Y, or Z. They just need to be in housing. And guess what happened to, I mean, look, obviously we want to decommodify housing. There's no question about it. But for those who don't buy that argument, putting homeless people in housing in Utah increased the home values in the area because they're in homes, right? And, you know, obviously there was social services to go along with that. And I think that's the other half of the equation that I think gets left out. You know, you see Democrats in the state of California essentially setting people up for failure. They want the kudos, they want the brownie points for doing things like early release of nonviolent offenders. And I think that's the right way to go. But then they don't provide a meaningful way for them to transition back into society. And as we know, housing is incredibly difficult for people who don't have felonies on their records. How are people who just got released from prison going to find a meaningful way to transition to society? So you see Democrats essentially set people up for failure, and that's a frustrating part of this as well. But I agree with you. Look, there are Band-Aids that we can implement, but really we need, I believe, a federal approach. And we need to stop seeing housing as a commodity, as something that people use to build wealth, and more as a human right that everyone in this country, everyone in the world is entitled to. It's just, it's the decent thing to do.
Yeah, I mean, one of the problems in the United States is that power is so diffused in our federal system, and it gives local communities so much power. And unfortunately, local communities can be quite reactionary. You know, like the smaller the unit, the more reactionary you become. Like, think about like a family. Like if something like threatens your family, you're like ready to murder someone, you know? But like the larger the unit, the better it is to achieve kind of progressive aims, because it's just more scale, and it's like more, you know, you don't feel as personally threatened by something. So, you know, the flip side is a place like Japan, which had a housing crisis in the 1980s, and a huge housing bubble that burst, and you know, they had a homeless problem in Tokyo and things like that. And the federal government just took over housing policy. They just said like, we're not letting the local municipalities, and they implemented kind of the opposite approach of like what we would argue for in something like in a place like Jacobin, which is they basically federally enforced the deregulation of the housing market, which it creates all kinds of problems, but it did increase the supply of housing so dramatically that that home prices and rentals have stayed relatively flat. You know, so what you see is like insane amounts of new buildings going up all the time, and with that and it's just all kind of willy-nilly. So but it does, at the end of the day, the laws of supply and demand do kind of reign supreme, and the huge amount of supply means that there's that rental prices and things like that stay relatively flat. In America, we have like the worst of both worlds, in which we have these choke points on supply, and then the little bit we do allow to build is all luxury housing.
That's right. Yeah.
And so that just keeps on driving home prices up everywhere. And there's just no one's doing anything at the federal level. Certainly, I mean, the situation with the eviction moratorium was absolutely crazy. I mean, I didn't put it in my segment because it would have gotten too long. But you know, the federally appropriated rental assistance that was passed during the pandemic, like they don't even get it out. Like it's just sitting there. They can't even get it out, and it would solve the problem.
It's so, I mean, this is another perfect example of Democrats setting people up for failure, because they appropriated the money, but they knew pretty well that states didn't have like the infrastructure necessary to distribute that funding, which is why much of that funding hasn't been distributed yet. And so it's incredibly frustrating. But I think you touched on so many important points in your segment, and I see this as something that's going to be a recurring conversation on the show.
If If you enjoyed this clip from Jacobin Weekends, please hit like and subscribe. You can also watch the full episode or catch any future live stream by clicking the join button below and becoming a Jacobin YouTube member. Thank you.